Hello friend, welcome back our YouTube channel Brothers Knowledge Hub. You will also get to see the daily current affairs here as well as important question and answer related to KVS, NVS, NET, JRF, SRF, physical education etc. Today's our topic respiratory system part 1. Guys, please my all video view, like, share and subscribe. Wait, press the bell icon.
The functions of the respiratory system includes, of course, providing tissues for gas exchange between the air and the bloodstream. Every animal needs gases to help them do aerobic respiration, and we're definitely one of them. We need oxygen gas being supplied to our tissues all throughout our life, especially the ones that are working really hard, like our muscles and our brain, of course. So having that tissue for getting gas into the body effectively and getting rid of the gas that's waste, that's very important. And along with that, the action of moving air in, the inhalation or inspiration, and moving air out of the body, exhalation or expiration. That's very important as well. It's a part of it. Also, the lungs, etc., protect the body from dehydration, temperature fluctuations, the entrance of pathogens. It's not, of course, just the lungs. It's a lot of the upper respiratory parts, and in addition to the lower respiratory parts, are participating in this. Dehydration, the losing of fluids, it doesn't just happen through sweat. You could lose fluids out of this passageway. After all, it is an entrance, exit into the body. The temperature fluctuations, you don't want to have cold air coming in. Let's say you were in a very cold part of the earth. You're in the Arctic and you're breathing in air that is below freezing. That would be harmful to your body. So every time you breathe in air, your respiratory tract is warming that air and moistening that air so that it's not as harsh to your body. And of course, the entrance of pathogens. You don't want bacteria and viruses that you're inhaling to constantly invade your cells. So the majority of that stuff that the average person inhales is not going to attack their tissues because the respiratory tract and respiratory system is defending your body. And of course, producing sounds, vocalization. I'm doing it right now. When I expel air across my vocal cords and I manipulate them in addition to my mouth, tongue, etc., you're going to hear speech. So when it comes to the breakdown of what's in the respiratory tract, we can look at the upper respiratory tract and then the lower respiratory tract. So the upper respiratory tract is going to include everything from the nose down to the throat. And so if we start with our first slide here, we're going to begin with the external nares. And that is a fancy term for nostrils. So these are my external nares. The hole that actually leads into that opening, into your respiratory tract, we can call the vestibule. And vestibule basically means like entrance or doorway, and there are other parts of the body where the term vestibule is used. So here, the actual holes in my nostrils, that entrance is called the vestibule. The nasal septum. Septum is a term used in other parts of the body as well. Like there's a septum in your heart that separates, for instance, the two ventricles from each other. And in this case, the nasal septum is separating the two sides of your nasal cavity, where your nostrils are, and the nasal conchae. The nasal septum is partially cartilaginous. So right here in blue, this is soft bone. This is cartilage of your nasal septum. And then a little bit further back, a little posterior / slightly superior, you can see that this is bony. It's the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. That's a good portion of your bony nasal septum, straight back here. And then just inferior to that is the vomer bone. And then the palatine bone is another part of it. So a few different bones make up the bony nasal septum. This particular image is great from Gray's Anatomy. It's just a perfect sagittal cross-section straight through the middle of this nasal region. And then, of course, the nasal conchae. If we were to look at other parts on the sides or lateral to this septum, the nasal conchae are those twists and turns of mostly the ethmoid bone. There are a couple other bones involved, but the ethmoid bone is the majority of that twisty-turny passageways leading air into the body. And along that, you're going to have the production of lots of mucus. And the mucus serves many purposes. One of them is catching dirt, catching bad stuff before it gets deeper and causing infections. When you're sick, you're going to produce a lot more mucus, and that makes sense. Upper respiratory tract, number 2. So if we keep looking at this area in the upper part of the respiratory system, the nasal mucosa is mainly in the nasal conchae region. But the reason why I'm listing it here is as you breathe air in and it ends up going down into the throat or the pharynx, the nasal mucosa not only is catching bad stuff, bacteria, viruses, etc., that you're breathing in, it also warms the air and moistens the air. Very important, so it's not as harsh to your lungs. If you think about it, the air in this room right here and possibly where you're at on Celsius scale is probably low 20s, 20 to 22 degrees. Fahrenheit scale, 70 to low 70s. That's room temperature. But your body temperature, Fahrenheit, 98 point something. Some people it's 98.6, 98.2, what have you. That's a big difference. So when you breathe in air, it warms it a bit, gets it close to your body temperature so it's not as harsh to your lungs. And of course, the moistening of air, very important too. You can say that the nasal mucosa humidifies the air, adds moisture to it as you're breathing it in. The pharynx, also known as the throat, we can separate into 3 different parts. And here they are from top to bottom, superior to inferior. The nasopharynx is the part of the throat that's adjacent to that nasal cavity or nasal conchae that you can see in here. So here are those, or at least a part of those little twists and turns of the ethmoid bone. And so that nasopharynx region is the connection where every time you swallow, you're going to get a little bit of mucus drainage. I know it's nasty, but that mucus drainage is going to go down your throat. And that's great in terms of protecting your body. If you're catching bacteria and viruses in the mucus of your nasal cavity, a great way to finally kill it is when you swallow it and it goes down your throat, down your esophagus, into your stomach. The acidity of your stomach is usually enough to destroy those things. The oropharynx, oro coming from oris or mouth, oral, that's the area of the pharynx that's adjacent to the tongue. So this is the tongue, kind of a weird looking tongue, but that's how it looks when you have a sagittal cross section and it's inside the mouth. That's what the tongue looks like. And right here, that's called the soft palate. The most posterior or dorsal part of the palate is actually soft compared to the hard palate. And so the part of the throat that's adjacent to there, I mean, as you're eating something, swallowing something, that's going to be passing through there. You also can breathe through the mouth. Really, your nose is meant for that. If you've done a lot of mouth breathing, you've probably noticed that it tends to dry out the mouth over time, and you're also not going to get that really good humidifying of the air that you get with breathing in through the nasal region. So that's the oropharynx. And finally, the most inferior part, the laryngopharynx, because the larynx is right there. So here we have, it's kind of like a fork in the road. Posterior passageway here, that is the esophagus. So when you do drink fluids, swallow, like I just did, swallow food, for instance, it's going to go down the esophagus. This is the larynx. And right here is the epiglottis. That's a flap that's going to close on top of this passageway so that when you do swallow, you don't want fluid and food going down into your lungs. That could cause you to aspirate and cause you to stop breathing and kill a person. So the laryngopharynx is that lowest part of the throat that's adjacent to the larynx. So when we look at the larynx, there are several parts involved, and that's, this part right here. We say voice box, we're talking larynx, but there's more to it than that. If we start at the most superior part of the larynx, like I mentioned in the previous slide, the epiglottis, which is right above the glottis, that's what that epi means, being above something. Every time you swallow, the epiglottis flaps down. It's a flap that closes on top of the glottis, and the glottis is the opening into the larynx passageway. Every time you swallow, that epiglottis is supposed to flap down, and the glottis is supposed to close so that fluid and solids are not going into the larynx and the trachea, your windpipe leading to the lungs. And we'll talk more about the glottis in a bit with respect to the vocal folds or vocal cords. The cartilage, there's a lot of cartilage involved with the larynx. Real quick before I move on, the epiglottis is this structure right here. This is a cross-section, once again, a sagittal cross-section to the larynx. It's like we're looking from the side view. So this is the epiglottis when it's not closed. So every time you swallow, it does close. So this person is not swallowing currently. You can't see the epiglottis in this shot, but if it were raised, you would see it poking out next to what's called the hyoid bone right there. So that would be where the epiglottis is. The glottis is just inferior to it, and you'll see a picture on the next slide of it. That's right in this region here. The cartilage, lots of cartilage going around, soft bone that's protecting your throat, protecting your airway. The thyroid cartilage is the most prominent one. The Adam's apple, if you've heard of that term, we're referring to what's called the thyroid cartilage. I'm going to do that in red. So here is the thyroid cartilage. And from that side view, if you were to, take a cross section through it, we're seeing part of the thyroid cartilage right here. So that is that typical looking Adam's apple that everyone has, not just men. People say, oh, a man has an Adam's apple and a woman typically doesn't. Well, a woman has all these structures as well, but an adult female, because of differences in sex hormones, it's typically not as visible. As a male goes through puberty, the size of the vocal folds and the larynx in general is going to become more visible. The vocal folds especially are going to get broader and larger, and that's going to have an effect on their voice. Your voice tends to drop when you age, go through puberty. And female voice changes a bit too, but not as dramatically in terms of the octave shift. So that thyroid cartilage, a major component in protecting the larynx, and that part that's most obvious right here that's sticking out, that's called the laryngeal prominence. It's a very prominent part of the larynx. And then the cricoid cartilage is just inferior to that. That's number 7 here. Here's the cricoid cartilage. Here it is in this little view. And in between those two cartilages, there's a ligament. There's another ligament right here. This is actually the laryngiohyoid ligament because it's connecting this part of the larynx to the hyoid bone, which I'm going to mention next. So the hyoid bone is an interesting bone because, to my knowledge, it's the only bone that I can think of that does not articulate with any other bones in the body. It is not directly touching any other bones. And if you think about how bones work, typically bone is next to bone in a joint, whether it's a fused immovable joint or a movable joint. But in this case, the hyoid bone is up here. I'm touching it right now. And it's held in place by muscles, ligaments, tendons. It's not actually touching any other bones. It's very close to the mandible, the lower jawbone, but it's not quite touching it. And the purpose of the hyoid bone is once again, like these other things, partially protective, but also it's for anchoring parts of the throat muscles and the tongue that helps in swallowing. So that's the hyoid bone. And then ligaments, I already mentioned some of them, ligaments here, ligaments all over the place. And remember, ligaments connect bone to bone or cartilage to bone. And then the vocal cords. You'll see a better view of the vocal cords on the next slide if you look down into the throat and look at the top of the larynx, like through, let's say, a little camera. As someone is talking, you can see there's slight little vibrations going on as air is expelled past the vocal cords. And depending on how they vibrate and the structure of those vocal folds, that's going to give you different pitches and different sounds. So sound production. Air passing through the glottis, the open glottis, vibrates the vocal folds and produces sound waves. This is a great view. This is an actual camera shot looking down into someone's, the top of their larynx and through the pharynx. And the glottis is this opening. The epiglottis, which you can't see in this particular image, is actually right in front of it, and it's currently not down because this person is expelling air, this person is talking. When you swallow, remember the epiglottis does close over this opening. Here's the anterior part. This is the front part. The posterior part is actually down this way. Diameter, length, and tension of these vocal folds, the vocal cords, changes the pitch. So here are the vocal folds right here. You know, if we were comparing the average male, average adult female, typically the diameter and length is going to be larger in an adult male compared to the female. What we have control over is the tension. Depending on how tense we make them, that's going to change pitch. So if I go, I'm actually changing the tension. I'm making the vocal folds thinner. But if I go, oh, I'm making them wider. And if you play a stringed instrument or play the piano, you're familiar with this. On a guitar, the particular strings that make the lower pitch notes, those are thicker strings. And the really ding, 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 those other strings that actually do the higher pitch ones, they're thinner. And it's the same with the piano. Remember, piano's hammers hitting strings, the ones at the far right end, they're going to be thinner than the really low notes at this end. And so that's how it works in terms of making different pitches. And like I said before, in general, adult males have thicker, longer cords compared to a female, but there, of course, are exceptions. That's a generalization. Speech, what I'm doing right now, is a combination of phonation, just making sound, and articulation, actually making different types of specific noises and specific manipulations of that sound. So phonation is just the process of expelling air as I'm exhaling, as I'm expelling air past the vocal folds in this glottis region. But articulation is when you take that sound and do what I'm doing right now. Movements of the mouth, lips, and tongue are going to manipulate that sound to make speech that's audible and understandable to somebody. If I didn't have my tongue, I could not make a wide variety of noises or letter sounds. So a T, when you make a T sound, there's a very specific movement that your tongue has to make to make that T sound. If my tongue wasn't there, I'd still have the phonation ability, but my articulation would not be there. Trachea. So we are now into the lower respiratory tract. Remember that the upper respiratory tract is from the nose to the pharynx. We just started the lower respiratory tract with the larynx, and we're definitely in the lower parts here. So the trachea, if you follow the path of your larynx, right here, I'm actually touching part of the trachea. If I press in, not too much, because I don't want to, suffocate myself, but if I press in a little bit, I can feel little rings here. And as I'm talking, I can actually feel vibrations, air going up here and then through the vocal cords, etc. So the other parts of the trachea you can't feel because it goes behind the manubrium, these parts of the sternum, but you can touch this part. And actually, this is where they would do a tracheostomy or tracheotomy to bypass the upper respiratory tract to help someone breathe. And I'll talk about that more in a sec. But the trachea is known also as the windpipe. This is that tube that's getting air into the lungs. It is a tough, flexible tube with cartilaginous rings. And you can see those rings, as I mentioned a second ago. I could feel them if I rub right here. Those cartilaginous rings are kind of C-shaped, but pointing this way, because the posterior or back portion is really not covered with cartilage in the sense that the anterior portion is. And the reason behind that is, if you remember from the previous slide, the esophagus is behind it. The esophagus is that food tube or liquid tube that's posterior to this. So every time you swallow and a chunk or bolus of food is being moved down your esophagus, you want slight flexibility for your trachea to kind of accommodate that. So there's slightly less cartilage in the posterior portion so that there is a little bit more flexibility when you do swallow something. So it is slightly flexible, not as much as these more posterior parts of the respiratory tree. We're going to get to that in a bit. Respiratory epithelium. So if you watch the previous lessons on the different types of tissues in the body and what epithelium is, epithelium, a reminder, is those cells that cover the outer surface of an organ or the innermost surface, usually where there's a passageway, a lumen for air, liquids, foods to go through. In this case, air is passing through. Every time you breathe in, every time you exhale, air is going back and forth. And the respiratory epithelium, if you were to zoom in to what's going on in the innermost part, the lumen of the trachea, and then the lumen of the entire respiratory tree, you would see cells that are filled with cilia. And these cilia look like hairs. It kind of looks like a shag carpet. My grandmother's house, the house she used to live in, had a green shag carpet, very 70s. And really, cilia looks like that. And they're constantly brushing up mucus. Constantly. If you didn't have those cilia bringing mucus generated from down here up and out, up into the throat, you could drown in the fluids that are produced in the lungs. Every time you hack a loogie, that's where that loogie, that spit is coming from. Yes, some of it is saliva, but we experience that when we have a cough, when we are sick and there's excess mucus production. We really do notice what those cilia are doing. People who smoke tend to destroy the cilia lining these passageways, and we don't typically regenerate them. So when you lose the cilia, you don't get them back. And that's why somebody who's a chronic smoker, smoking for years, is more likely to get pneumonia, an infection associated with basically too much pooling of fluids in the respiratory passageways. But a healthy person is able to get those fluids up and out. And the mucosa here in the trachea resembles that of the more superior structures. The production of mucus here is very similar to what you're going to see in the mucosa of the nasal passageways and into the pharynx.
Friends, I hope you all like this video. Please friends, my all video, view, like, share and subscribe with press the bell icon. Thank you for my watching video.